after having seen the resting membrane potential and how that resting membrane potential of -70 or -90 comes on the membranes, let us now see what happens when the membrane excites. The nerve and the muscle are the excitable cells, they are the excitable tissues, they have excitable cells, and their membranes excite and signal is transmitted in that form of membrane excitation. But one thing that we should carry forward from the previous discussion about the resting membrane potential and equilibrium potential is the point that we should carry forward is that if the membrane potential at any given moment is very close to the equilibrium potential for an ion, then that ion will not move much. It will stay near equilibrium. And if the membrane potential has moved far away from the equilibrium potential of an ion, then the ion movement will be much greater. Let us now come to the second section of this discussion, when the membrane excites. So second segment is about membrane excitation and impulse transmission. Before we discuss about the membrane excitation and what all things happen, let us see a few aspects of the stimulus. We apply a stimulus to a nerve and its membrane excites. So we need to know everything about the stimulus. Stimulus has a few properties, and there was an MCQ very recently asked on the properties of the stimulus. The MCQ was asking that there are these 4 stimuli shown in the diagram in this image. Which one of them is least likely to excite a nerve? A, B, C, or D. 4 stimuli have been shown in this image. Which one of them is good? Which one of them is bad? First of all, what are the 2 properties of a stimulus? You see, this vertical axis is showing intensity of the stimulus and horizontal is showing duration for which the stimulus is applied. So, a stimulus has 2 properties, intensity and duration, and it's the interplay of these 2 properties that decides the quality of a stimulus. Let us try to understand these 2 properties. Intensity. You know, stimulus intensity should be a rapidly rising intensity. Stimulus intensity should be rapidly rising intensity, because a slowly rising stimulus intensity would cause the sodium channel opening. For membrane excitation, there is going to be sodium channel opening. That sodium channel opening would be very slow if your stimulus intensity is slowly rising, and then it so happens that the excitation, which needs a sudden surge of sodium at one point at threshold, that will never happen. Threshold will be crossed, and yet action potential will not be generated at all. That's called as membrane accommodation. So at this point, let's just keep this in mind, that a slowly rising stimulus intensity, if you apply such a stimulus, then it would result in what is called as membrane accommodation. Membrane accommodation means the threshold will be crossed by the membrane potential would cross threshold, and yet membrane will not excite, action potential will not generate at all. That's called as membrane accommodation. That's because of slow opening of sodium channels. We will see this later once again when we discuss action potential and its phases, but for now it should be kept in mind that slowly rising stimulus intensity may not result in membrane excitation. So we had shown the diagram about the stimuli. A slowly rising intensity like this will not cause membrane to excite. Second property of the stimulus is duration. Duration should be optimum enough. This optimum is different for different tissues, but there should be good enough duration for the tissue to excite. So the fourth stimulus which we had shown in the image, this does not have a good duration, and that also might fail to excite the nerve. That brings us to the first two stimuli which were shown in that image. Therefore, let's see what are the two best types of stimuli. The two best types of stimuli. Best one is called as a rectangular pulse. It's described as the rectangular pulse. This is the best type of stimulus. The stimulus intensity rises instantly, reaches peak, it stays at the peak and then falls to zero. This is the best stimulus. Intensity rising rapidly, duration is good. This is the best stimulus. Second best is called as exponential pulse. Exponential pulse. That is, stimulus intensity rises rapidly and then it declines over a certain duration. Duration is good. Stimulus intensity was rising rapidly. Therefore, this also will excite the nerve. These two are the best types of stimuli. But the point is, a stimulus is an interplay of two properties, intensity and duration. Therefore, related to these, there are two definitions that one must know. First definition is Rheobase. Rheobase is minimum strength of the stimulus that can excite a tissue. Minimum strength of the stimulus that can excite a tissue when passed for infinite amount of time through that tissue. Time no bar, time no limit. You can pass that stimulus for whatever length of time. But if that excites a tissue, it's called as Rheobase. Minimum strength of the stimulus that can excite a tissue. Right. Now we know what is a minimum strength. What we then do is double the strength, double this Rheobase and apply it to the tissue and see how much time the tissue takes to excite, and that time would be called as chronaxy. Chronaxy. It's the time taken by the tissue to excite when the stimulus strength is double the Rheobase. We will double the Rheobase strength, apply it to the tissue and see how much time does it take, the tissue takes to excite. That's called as chronaxy. That time is called as chronaxy, and therefore chronaxy is said to be the measure of excitability of a tissue. Shorter the chronaxy, that means the tissue excites in less duration, and that means it is more excitable. Shorter the chronaxy, more excitable the tissue. Thus, chronaxy is the measure of excitability of a tissue. Let's see some of the tissues with their chronaxes, or rather increasing order of chronaxes. Myelinated nerve has least chronaxy. So among the nerve and different types of muscles, myelinated nerve is the most excitable tissue with least chronaxy, means most excitable, followed by unmyelinated nerve, slightly longer chronaxy, followed by skeletal muscle, followed by cardiac muscle, and finally smooth muscle. This is the order of chronaxes, least to highest chronaxy, or most excitable to less excitable tissues. This is the order. All right, that's about the excitability of the different tissues. We are only considering nerve and muscle because I remember in the first stage of this discussion I said hair cell is the most excitable cell in the body because of the highest transmembrane voltage gradient. Yes, that's also a fact. Here I am considering only the nerve and muscle. Right. This was about stimulus and membrane excitation related to the stimulus. Now let's see what happens when membrane excites. So next section would be membrane excitation. When we apply the stimulus, membrane will excite. Membrane excitation and impulse transmission. That the membrane excites and that excitation travels through the nerve, that would be the signal transmission or impulse transmission. Now the first point in this is that the impulse transmission occurs in two formats. At the very outset, I had already mentioned that membrane excites means what? That inside of the membrane is negative, it becomes positive and it travels. That's the membrane excitation. So, membrane excitation and impulse transmission occurs in two forms or two formats. One is called as action potential generation and action potential propagation. That action potential develops at one point and that travels or propagates. The other form is called as electrotonic conduction. Electrotonic conduction. So let's see what these forms are and how impulse is transmitted as a combination of these two forms. Impulse transmission would be a combination of these two forms. Let's look at them one by one. First, the electrotonic conduction. You see, before we see the electrotonic conduction, let's just see the structure of a neuron. The neuron is the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. It has got nerve cell body with its extensions. The membrane of the nerve cell body is soma, and these are the dendrites, the short extensions all around, and this axon on one end. This is a typical neuron. Now, where the axon emerges, where the axon starts, that part is called as axon hillock or initial segment. Axon hillock or initial segment. This is a neuron, and how impulse is transmitted from one neuron to the next and then so on is like this, that a neuron generally receives impulse from the previous neuron over the dendrite. First neuron will send the impulse to the next neuron over the dendrite. From the dendrite to the axon hillock, the impulse will travel and then it will travel down the next axon. This is how impulses are transmitted. Axons are meant to cover the distance, to cover the length, right? And I have already mentioned that impulse transmission is a combination of electrotonic conduction and action potential propagation. So let's see what these transmissions are. After having discussed about the stimulus and its properties, let's now discuss membrane excitation. When we apply the stimulus, the membrane excites, the nerve membrane excites, and impulse is transmitted through the nerve. What is the purpose of this? It's the signal transmission. Nerve is sending the signal to another nerve, or it is sending a signal to the muscle. Then the muscle membrane excites, and as a result, the muscle would contract. That's the purpose of membrane excitation. And what happens in membrane excitation is that the nerve, which is resting at minus 70 millivolts, inside of the membrane would become positive. This will happen at all the points, and that is how impulse will be transmitted through the nerve. Let us see how this happens. Membrane excitation, what happens exactly during that excitation and impulse transmission. The first point is impulse transmission occurs in two formats or two forms. One is action potential generation and action potential propagation. Each point of the nerve will develop action potential, and in that manner it will travel further and further into the nerve. The other form is called as electrotonic conduction, and in real sense, impulse transmission is a combination of these two processes. It's a combination of electrotonic conduction and action potential propagation. Let us see these forms one by one. First, the electrotonic conduction. Electrotonic conduction is a direct and passive spread of charges from the point of entry. It's a direct transfer of charges or direct spread of charges from the point of entry. So let's see the diagrammatic view. You see, if this is a nerve, you stimulate the nerve at one point. What happens is sodium channels will open here. Sodium will enter from this point. It will carry a lot of positive charges. And those positive charges themselves will travel over a certain distance passively. Why would they travel? Because this nerve is resting at minus. There is a minus charge on the membrane, and therefore these positive charges that have entered, they will be attracted to those minus charges. That is how they will travel passively over the certain distance. That is the electrotonic conduction. One point that needs to be understood is that as the charges travel, they will leak across the membrane, leak out of the membrane. The charges leak because of the so-called membrane capacitance. Because of this membrane capacitance, as the charges are traveling, there is leakage of charges across the membrane. And therefore, the strength of this signal will become weak and weak and weak gradually over the distance. Finally, by a certain distance, this signal will be completely extinguished and stopped. All the charges will have leaked out. Such a transmission is called as decremental conduction. So, electrotonic conduction is a decremental conduction. We will later see that action potential propagation is a non-decremental conduction. But this is a decremental conduction. It decreases in strength. This signal strength decreases as it travels. And another point is, by 10 millimeters length of the nerve, it will completely stop. This type of conduction can carry the signal, carry the impulse for only up to 10 millimeters length, and then it will be completely extinguished and stopped. That is the electrotonic conduction. Let us see how and where this happens. You see, this is a typical structure of a neuron. A neuron has nerve cell body and its extensions all around. And then there is an axon on one end. The axon, which is actually a nerve fiber, as we call it. These are the dendrites, the small extensions. Now, first point of the axon, from where the axon arises from the nerve cell body, this is called as axon hillock. Axon hillock or initial segment. And it is this point which develops first action potential. I mean, for majority of the neurons, the first point where the action potential is developed is the axon hillock. Barring the sensory neurons, cutaneous sensory neurons, for all other neurons, their first action potential will be developed, or the first point where action potential develops is the axon hillock. But this is not an isolated neuron. This is a part of some circuit. It is a part of some pathway. And that means this neuron is going to receive the impulse from some previous neuron. Remember, dendrites are the receptor zones. They are the ones where the impulse is received from the previous neuron. So let's say here is the dendrite where impulse is received from the first neuron at this point. Now, dendritic spine and the cell soma, they do not have enough number of sodium channels, and therefore they will not be able to generate the action potential. Therefore, what happens is, at this first point, the sodium will enter from the first point of the dendrite, and it will carry a lot of positive charges. Those positive charges will travel electrotonically. So, from dendrite to axon hillock, the impulse will travel electrotonically. There will be electrotonic conduction. The charges travel passively. There cannot be action potential generation. There are no enough number of sodium channels. And as the charges reach at this point, axon hillock, then the action potential will be developed at this point. That's the first point where action potential develops. Why is it that action potential develops at axon hillock and then it is transmitted down the axon? Is that two reasons. One is there are enough number of sodium channels at the axon hillock, and second, axon hillock has lower threshold for generation of action potential, so it would be rather easier to develop action potential at the axon hillock, and thus the impulse will travel like this as a combination: electrotonic conduction from the dendrite to axon hillock, and then at the axon hillock there will be generation of action potential. From this point onward, how the impulse travels? Let's say this is the axon hillock and this is the axon, the nerve fiber. It is myelinated. It is covered with the myelin. And at regular distances, this myelin is broken. The nerve membrane is exposed. These are called as nodes of Ranvier. So, first AP developed here, and then sodium which has come in from this point, it carried a lot of positive charges. Those positive charges will travel electrotonically up to the next node of Ranvier. When the charges reach here, this node will automatically reach threshold. Sodium channels will open at this point. Sodium will come in and the node of Ranvier will depolarize. It will develop the action potential. The sodium that has come in will travel to the next node of Ranvier from within the axon. So, as you can see, action potential develops at the nodes of Ranvier, and node-to-node transmission is also electrotonic conduction. The charges are traveling electrotonically. Direct spread of charges is happening. Since action potential is developing at such long distances, therefore this has been termed as saltatory conduction. Saltare means leap or jump. It is felt, it is perceived that the action potential has jumped a lot of distance. It is happening here and then here and then here. So it is felt as if it has jumped a lot of distance. But in reality, nothing is jumping. In reality, it's traveling from node to node in an electrotonic fashion. Only thing is, this time, I mean, for this myelinated axon, this electrotonic conduction will be less decremental. Electrotonic conduction, I mentioned, it is decremental conduction. The charges leak out of the membrane and the signal strength becomes weak and weak and weak. But over here, the decrement would be less because the overlying myelin sheath, it decreases the membrane capacitance and it increases the membrane resistance. Resistance is inversely proportional to capacitance, or capacitance is inversely proportional to resistance. Therefore, myelin sheath decreases the capacitance, increases the resistance, and therefore this leakage of charges would be less, and it means quite a substantial amount of charges will reach the next node of Ranvier, and then that node will automatically reach threshold. Sodium channels will open there. This node will develop into action potential and depolarization. As the sodium has come in, it will carry forward to the next, those charges will travel to the next node of Ranvier. This is therefore a combination of action potential at the nodes and node to node, the electrotonic transmission, conduction electrotonically. There are a few places where you see electrotonic conduction. So I may just mention a few places where electrotonic conduction is seen. For example, retinal circuits retina has electrotonic conduction. You see, the retinal circuits have rod, bipolar cell and ganglion cell. And then there is a visual pathway, optic nerve fibers from the ganglion cell onward. So, in this retinal circuit, up to the ganglion cell, there is electrotonic conduction. The cells are connected with gap junctions, so there will be direct spread of charges from cell to cell, and the charges travel electrotonically. From ganglion cell onward, in the optic nerve fibers, there would be action potential propagation. So again, it's a combination of electrotonic conduction and action potential generation and propagation. That's electrotonic conduction with a few examples. We also saw how the impulse transmission occurs in the myelinated nerve. It's a combination again, action potential at the nodes and electrotonic conduction from node to node. Let us try to understand what happens at in an unmyelinated nerve. You see, compare with myelinated axon. In the myelinated axon, the myelinated nerve fiber, the sodium channels are concentrated at the nodes of Ranvier, and there are no sodium channels beneath the myelin sheath. So, sodium that comes in from one node is going to travel a lot of distance it can travel a lot of distance in substantial amount because of the myelin. There was myelin that increases the membrane resistance, and therefore positive charges could travel a lot of distance without leaking, or rather there was less leakage. Compare this with unmyelinated nerve. In the case of unmyelinated axon, sodium channels are located very close to each other at regular distances and very close to each other. So here it will be purely action potential propagation, no electrotonic conduction or in the real sense. What's going to happen is, if you simulate the first point, and to make this example understandable, I would like to give an example. If you have seen a line of firecrackers, what happens is that you just give fire to the first cracker, it reaches threshold and it bursts, and then you don't have to do anything. It goes on its own. First cracker, as it bursts, it passes the flame to the second cracker, so second cracker automatically reaches threshold and bursts, and then it passes the flame to the third cracker automatically reaches threshold and bursts. Similar thing is going to happen here. First point, you stimulated the first point reaches threshold, sodium channels have opened, sodium comes in, and those positive charges, they just go to the adjacent point. Adjacent point will now automatically reach threshold, sodium channels will open there, sodium will come in and will go to the third point. So the second point developed action potential, depolarization happened, sodium came in, it goes to the third point which was resting will now reach threshold automatically because of these positive charges, and now sodium channels will open there and that point will also burst into action potential, and then it will go on and on and on. That is what happens in the unmyelinated nerve. So if this is called as saltatory conduction, saltare means leap or jump, where it is felt as if the action potential has jumped a lot of distance. Over here, this transmission is called as the flow of local circuits. The ions, they flow locally from one point to the next point only. The reason is also obvious. Because there is no myelin, the charges are going to leak. After all, its electrotonic conduction is a leaking of charges that happens. And therefore, sodium channels are provided at very close distances. So, just next point has to reach threshold. Therefore, sodium channels are very close by, whereas here, in the case of myelinated nerve, they are at long distances at the nodes of Ranvier. That's the saltatory conduction. This is flow of local circuits. Every next point is going to develop action potential. What are the advantages of saltatory conduction? Saltatory conduction, therefore, will have at least two advantages. One is it is faster, because only the nodes are going to depolarize, and node to node conduction is electrotonic. Therefore, this is going to be faster. Only a few nodes will show action potential. Action potential duration is about 1 milliseconds in the case of nerve. So, impulse will travel faster from point A to point B. And for the same length, in unmyelinated nerve, impulse transmission will be little slower, because every next point is developing action potential. It will be slower to go from point A to point B. Okay. Second advantage of the saltatory conduction, that it consumes less energy, less ATP. Now the question is, action potential is diffusion of ions. Sodium diffuses in, that's depolarization. And then potassium diffuses out, that's repolarization. So where is the question of energy consumption here? Energy consumption is not needed for action potential. Energy consumption happens for the process called as recharging. We've seen this in the discussion of sodium potassium pump, that after every impulse, after generation of action potential or transmission of impulse, the nerve has to be recharged, or that tissue, whether it's nerve or muscle, it has to be recharged. Sodium has come in to cause depolarization. Potassium has gone out to cause repolarization, again recovery from excitation. These ionic levels have to be restored again. The sodium that came in has to be sent out, and potassium that went out has to be brought back in. This is called as recharging, and this recharging is done by sodium potassium pump. Now, in the case of saltatory conduction, only nodes are depolarizing. So, recharging will happen only at certain points, these points, the nodes of Ranvier. Whereas in the case of unmyelinated nerve, recharging will have to occur at every point. That means sodium potassium pump will act at every point, and therefore it will break more ATPs. More ATPs will be consumed in the case of unmyelinated nerve. So that's the advantage of saltatory conduction over transmission through unmyelinated nerve. One more issue that needs to be understood here is the demyelinating diseases. Multiple sclerosis is the example. Multiple sclerosis is a demyelinating disease of the neuron, and what happens is, after a certain amount of demyelination, this myelin cover is gone and bare neuronal axonal membrane is exposed. Conduction blocks happen, means conduction stops after a certain amount of demyelination. The question is why? Because this myelin is lost, so this neuron which is myelinated now it has become unmyelinated. Demyelination means it has now become unmyelinated. Why doesn't it conduct the action potentials? Well, yes, unmyelinated neurons also conduct the action potentials, but they have sodium channels placed at very close by distances from the beginning, from the birth or from the development. But here, in the case of myelinated axon, sodium channels were located at the nodes of Ranvier. After demyelination, what is known to happen is the sodium channels get relocated along the length of the axon. They will get scattered. And since there is no myelin sheath now, there will be a lot of leakage of charges across the membrane as they come in from one point. Scattering of the sodium channels along the length of the axon, loss of myelin, so membrane capacitance has increased, resistance was provided by the myelin sheath. Because of this, after a certain amount of demyelination, the conduction blocks begin to appear. You know, average internodal distance is about 1 to 3 millimeters. Average internodal distance in the case of a myelinated axon, node to node distance is about 1 to 3 millimeters, and it is said that after demyelination has involved 3 or more than 3 nodes of Ranvier, that much distance or that much length is involved in demyelination. After that, the conduction blocks will begin to appear. The simple calculation can be like this. Supposing average internodal distance is 3 millimeters. So, remember, electrotonic conduction can carry the impulse for only up to 10 millimeters length. Therefore, more than 3 nodes involved in demyelination. What will happen is, suppose you stimulate this point. Now the nerve has become, it's a demyelinating disease. You stimulated one point and electrotonic conduction will happen over a certain distance, fine. But by the time it reaches the next sodium channel, aggregation of sodium channels, these positive charges will have leaked out so much, now that there is no myelin, that these positive charges will not be able to take this point up to threshold, and therefore this point will not develop, it will fail to develop action potential. Electrotonic conduction was itself a decremental conduction, so it is going to stop over a length of 10 millimeters. So remember, in a simple manner, remember like this: if you consider the average internodal distance to be 3 millimeters and electrotonic conduction can carry the impulse for only up to 10 millimeters. So remember like this: more than 3 nodes involved in the process of demyelination and the conduction blocks will begin to appear. Just a simplistic way of remembering this correlation. That's about the symptoms of conduction block. And one last point may be added is that we discussed in the chapter of diffusion and transport processes that increased temperature increases the kinetic energy and therefore diffusion becomes better. But in the case of multiple sclerosis, the demyelinating disease, hot bath, when the patients take hot bath, the symptoms of conduction blocks become worse. They worsen. Why? The simple explanation would be that with hot bath and increased temperature, the membrane capacitance would increase. So sodium and the positive charges which have come in, they would leak more after increased temperature. And because of this increased leakage of charges, conduction will stop early, or rather symptoms of conduction blocks would become worse. In fact, the patients may be provided with cold packs so that membrane capacitance decreases and leakage of charges becomes less. That was electrotonic conduction. We saw a few aspects of that. Let us now discuss the action potential and its properties. Well, to begin with, I will just summarize the properties of the action potential. Action potential is a self-regenerative process. Just remember that example of firecrackers, the line of firecrackers, the way it goes on bursting. Those same properties also applicable here. Self-regenerative process, and it's a self-propagated process. It propagates by itself. Just one point needs to reach the threshold, and then it will go on. Just like the firecrackers, if the first cracker reaches threshold, then it will go on bursting all by itself. It is a non-decremental conduction. Action potential is a non-decremental type of conduction. It does not decrease in amplitude, it does not decrease in strength as it travels over a distance. Whatever is the length of the nerve, at all those points or entire length of the nerve, the action potential is happening at various points. The amplitude will remain the same. Compare this with electrotonic conduction, which was decremental conduction, direct spread of charges. And action potential obeys all or none law, all or nothing principle. Again, like firecracker, if it reaches threshold, it bursts with full sound. If it does not reach threshold, nothing, no sound. So 0 or full, nothing in between. Same is the case with action potential. If one point reaches threshold, it will develop full action potential, and then all points will develop full action potential. So all, or entire response or no response. If the first point does not reach threshold, it will not develop any action potential, neither will any other point. So 0 response or full response, nothing in between. There are no gradations. You see, later on we will see that there are some potentials in the body which are called as graded potentials. Action potential is not a graded potential. There are no gradations in this. Well, that's just the introduction to the topic of action potential. Let's see what are the changes that happen at one point of the nerve when it develops action potential. So, phases of an action potential at one point of the nerve. This is the nerve. I stimulate the nerve at the first point. What all things happen here when it develops into the action potential is that first thing, that it is recorded by an instrument called as cathode ray oscilloscope, CRO. Well, remember, ionic fluxes from one channel can be recorded by using patch clamp technique, which we have already discussed, which we have already seen. A second, membrane potentials, potential changes over a certain length of the membrane can be studied by voltage clamp technique. And then action potential changes are recorded and studied by the instrument called as cathode ray oscilloscope. How does it work? Simply speaking, an electrode is placed at this point to see the changes, to record the changes at that one point. It's connected with this cathode ray oscilloscope. It's a tube, and on one end there is a screen. There is an electron gun. The beam of electron passes and strikes on the screen. So, this electrode will pick up the changes happening at one point, and those potential changes are transferred to the tube. The tube has two pairs of metal plates, one vertical pair, one horizontal pair. These electrical changes, voltage changes that occurred at one point, picked up by the electrode, passed on to the tube. Accordingly, these metal plates will move according to those electrical changes, voltage changes. And as the metal plates move, this beam of electrons which is passing through those metal plates will also move while striking the screen, and it will give you a graphic record of those potential changes. So graphic record can be obtained in this manner from one point. Let us now try to understand what are those phases of action potential at one point of the nerve as recorded graphically by cathode ray oscilloscope. Well, there are two basic changes. We are talking of one point, what all things happen there. Graphically, it can be described like this. Two basic changes happen at that point. Inside of the nerve becomes positive, which is called as depolarization. And inside of the nerve, that point will again become negative, which is called as repolarization. See, one can imagine like this. Any cell, this is just to explain, any cell inside has excess negative charges compared to outside. This is the polarized state of the cell. Let us say it is a polarized state of the cell in the resting state. When this polarity gets disturbed and inside becomes positive, we would call it depolarization. And when that polarity is again restored and inside again becomes negative, it will be called as repolarization. So depolarization and repolarization are the two basic changes. Depolarization occurs because of sodium entry. Sodium enters, positive charges enter, the inside of the point becomes positive. And repolarization is because of potassium exit. Potassium leaves from that point. So positive charges leave and therefore inside again becomes negative. Well, these are the two basic changes. Now let's see what are the other various ways of depolarization. This is happening at the nerve. Nerve is depolarized in this manner. But there are other ways of depolarization also. Various other ways of depolarization or other ions responsible for depolarization. For instance, calcium entry can cause depolarization, where in the case of heart, SA node, calcium influx results in depolarization. Second, potassium entry can cause depolarization, where there is only one cell where this is possible. Look, potassium is, I am saying potassium entry, okay? Potassium will come in and the cell will depolarize. For that to happen, potassium has to be more on the outside. That's possible only for one cell, and that is hair cell in the cochlea and vestibular apparatus. Hair cell is surrounded by a fluid called as endolymph. We've already seen this, that endolymph has excess potassium ions, although it is ECF. So, hair cell, at the top of the hair cell there are stereocilia. When the stereocilia bend, when those hair bend, potassium entry occurs from the top of the hair cell, and the hair cell will be depolarized. Well, that opens calcium channels. Calcium will come in, and then the neurotransmitter, which is glutamate, will be released at this synapse. It will excite the 8th cranial nerve fibers. So, but the point was, potassium entry also can cause depolarization in certain cell. Only one cell, of course, for which potassium is more on the outside. Hair cell. Third way of depolarization is accumulation of potassium inside the membrane. That's one more way of depolarization. Accumulation of potassium inside the membrane. Where does this happen? This happens at many places. Let's see one example. Pancreatic beta cell is one example. Pancreatic beta cell, we have already discussed its way of depolarization. Just to summarize it, intracellular potassium, we discussed that this pancreatic beta cell has ATP sensitive potassium channels, and when glucose enters the pancreatic beta cell, it undergoes glycolysis that generates ATPs, and then ATP sensitive potassium channel will close. So this intracellular potassium, which can go out, now it cannot go out, so it just comes and starts accumulating near the membrane on the inside, and positive charges getting accumulated inside the membrane means membrane depolarization. So either these positive charges can come in from outside, or intracellular positive charges, which are at the core of the cell, can come near the membrane, and the membrane can depolarize, membrane can excite. These are the different ways in which different tissues are depolarized. But we are talking about the nerve. Let's come back to the nerve. Basic two changes, depolarization and repolarization. Let's also see the other phases. You can see initially the graph is rising slowly, and after a certain potential is reached, this potential of course is called as threshold. A very important concept of threshold which needs to be understood. When the membrane potential reaches minus 55, then you can see the graph has risen very rapidly. So it's crossed 0 mark and it has become plus 35 to plus 45. All right, so this is called as threshold, where the up to which the graph has risen slowly. And then there is upstroke, rapid upstroke. Part above zero is called as overshoot. These are the phases of depolarization: upstroke and overshoot above the threshold. Well, also part above zero, or rather I should say rapid rise and rapid fall of the graph, is called as spike. Rapid rise and rapid fall, this portion is termed as spike. So one must remember that action potential is sometimes interchangeably used with spike potential, action potential propagation or spike propagation. That's how it can be interchangeably used. Right. The other phases in this graph, this part, the repolarization has slowed down. This part, this slowdown of repolarization. See, initially it was rapid, but then it has slowed down. This part is called as after depolarization. Make no mistake, it's a misnomer, because this is repolarization, but it is being termed after depolarization. So it's a misnomer. This slowdown is called as after depolarization, and the graph has gone below the original potential. It has gone almost to minus 90 millivolts. This would be called as hyperpolarization, sometimes called as after hyperpolarization or simply hyperpolarization. Inside becoming even more negative than original. These are the phases of action potential at one point of the nerve. Let us try to understand the ionic basis further in detail. Let's start with depolarization. Well, before we start, I can just ask you two MCQs related to this image. So think and answer. Okay. I am showing 4 points A, B, C and D. The first question is, sodium channel closure begins at what point? And the options are A to B, B to C, C to D or at D. At what point of time or at what voltage the sodium channels will close? Very often people tend to think that it may be at D, because very often it is believed that sodium is coming in, and then when the potential became plus 35, the channels are closed and sodium entry stops. No, that's not right. The answer is somewhere between B and C, the sodium channels will close. Then how come potential still goes to plus 35? Inside, how come it becomes positive? We will see that in the discussion. Second MCQ, potassium channel opening and potassium exit starts at what point, at what time or at what point? And the same 4 options, A to B, B to C, C to D or at D. Well, again, very often the students think it must be at D, because the potential has become plus 35. So now, and sodium entry has stopped. Now the potassium will start going out and therefore repolarization will start. No, again, that's not correct. Potassium exit starts somewhere between point A and point B. Sodium entry has started. Same stimulus is going to open the potassium channels and potassium exit will happen. Still, the membrane is depolarized. I mean, sodium is coming in and at the same time potassium is also going out. How is then that the depolarization happens? We will see that. In the discussion, we will try to understand how come that sodium coming in and potassium going out at the same time and still depolarization is happening. First point, let's see the phases of depolarization. Let us see the changes in depolarization. First, from RMP to threshold. We saw that it happens slowly. The entry of positive charges is going to be slow. Well, just let's take an example to understand how depolarization actually happens. Imagine a football stadium. There are small gates to the stadium. All those gates are closed right now. And there is a massive crowd waiting outside to go into the stadium. That crowd is pushing in to trying to go into the stadium. Something like our sodium, 141 on the outside and 14 on the inside, is that crowd that is trying to push in. 2-3 people, they somehow open the first gate of that stadium and they go in. After going in, they open the second gate. So 2-3 more people enter from the second gate. Then 2-3 more people go in, they open the next gate. 2-3 more people will go in, that opens the fourth gate, and so on and so on. So 2-3 people are going in, they are opening the next and next gates. And at one point, all the gates have opened. Let's imagine this. So a big passage has been created. This is just an example to understand what happens in depolarization. A massive passage has been created now, a big passage. So this crowd which is trying to push in, it will now enter with a single push. It will try to enter the stadium. But even as that was happening, that single push was happening, somebody was watching from the CCTV, so that person immediately closes the gates. That means whatever crowd could come in that single push will get to enter the stadium and will get to sit and watch the match. Now apply this example, or keep this example in mind to understand how the sodium behaves during depolarization. RMP to threshold, there is a positive feedback cycle involving sodium channels. Okay, what happens is, you apply the stimulus, initially some sodium channels open, some sodium channels open, therefore some sodium enters, which means some positive charges have entered through that point. Therefore membrane potential drops to a less negative value, and that opens some more sodium channels. So some more sodium comes in, membrane potential becomes even less negative, and that opens some more sodium channels. So this positive feedback cycle will happen, and therefore membrane potential is becoming less and less negative as it reaches threshold. So second point is the concept of threshold. What is threshold? What happens at threshold is a critical number of sodium channels would be open. They have opened by now a critical number of sodium channels. So now with a single push the sodium will enter. Therefore there would be a massive instantaneous surge of sodium, massive instantaneous influx or surge of sodium in a single push, immediately followed by closure of sodium channels. I am using the word closure over here, actually it is inactivation. Immediately followed by the closure of sodium channels. So threshold is that concept which is responsible for all or nothing principle. If threshold is reached, now the action potential will become inevitable. Why? Because enough number of sodium channels are open now, or a certain number is open, there will be a massive influx because sodium had a good concentration gradient. So there will be a massive entry of sodium. But even as the membrane potential immediately rises, is approaching zero and going to plus, the sodium channels will be closed. Therefore, you see, sodium channels are closed at what point? This was the MCQ. The answer would be above threshold, somewhere between B and C. Because at B, already the massive influx has happened in one single push, and immediately the sodium channels are closed, so that whatever sodium comes in that one single push will take the membrane potential straight to plus 35. I mean, this question was always very important. Why the potential goes to plus 35 only? Can it go to plus 45? Can it go to plus 60, which is the equilibrium potential for sodium? Can it stop at zero? All these questions are relevant. You see, if the channels remain open and sodium is allowed to come in, then the membrane potential would reach plus 60 millivolts, which is the equilibrium potential for sodium. When membrane potential reaches plus 60 millivolts, then the sodium channels, then the sodium movement will stop, or sodium reach equilibrium. But that's not happening. I mean, that's not the case. That sodium channels are open and sodium is coming in and taking the voltage to plus. No, it's just one single push at threshold and closure of sodium channels. So whatever sodium comes in that one single push will take the potential only to plus 35. That's one point to be understood. Why not? It goes to plus 60 millivolt, which is the equilibrium potential. As we have discussed in that section, that the movement of ion will stop when membrane potential has reached the equilibrium potential for that ion. But here it's not that the channels were open. Channels closed at just above threshold with a massive influx of sodium, and the channels closed. So somewhere between B and C, the channels would have closed. But by that time, sodium has already entered and it takes the potential to plus 35. You will also see that they will say plus 35 to plus 45 millivolts. It's not a fixed value. Why? Because it will depend on the ECF sodium. You see, if the ECF sodium is decreased, let's say hyponatremia, then concentration gradient for sodium will narrow, and then at threshold, with that massive influx, less sodium will come in, and therefore the potential might go to only up to plus 25 or something. Or if it is more sodium in the ECF, potential can go to plus 40 or plus 45. Therefore, amplitude of the action potential is fixed when the conditions are same, when the conditions are fixed. If the conditions change, like serum sodium is changed, then amplitude can vary. But still, it's all or none law. That is, threshold has to be reached. If threshold is reached, action potential will be inevitable. It will happen. If threshold is not reached, then it will not develop at all. Second point is membrane accommodation. Sometimes threshold is reached and threshold is crossed, and yet action potential fails to develop. Threshold gets crossed. Still, membrane potential kept rising, but it never caused that spike or sudden surge. Why? We saw one reason for that. It was a slowly rising stimulus will cause membrane accommodation. Why? Because if there is a slowly rising stimulus intensity, then the opening of sodium channels would be very slow. We saw that positive feedback of sodium channels. Some sodium channels open, some sodium enters, and that opens some more sodium channels. If slowly rising stimulus intensity happens to be there, then what happens is membrane potential is rising very, very slowly, and sodium channel opening is very, very slow. So much so that at threshold, enough number of sodium channels or critical number of sodium channels would not be open. Why? Because it was so slow opening that the channels which opened early would have begun to close by now. So the channels which opened at early stage, they would have begun to close, and therefore enough number, critical number would never be open at any one point. You see, for the spike to be generated, you need critical number of sodium channels to be open at one single point of time. That will not happen if the sodium channels are opening slowly. First channels which opened, they would begin to close also, and enough number of channels would not be open at one single point, and therefore spike would not be generated. Such a scenario is called as membrane accommodation. Threshold will be reached, threshold will be crossed, because sodium is coming, but it's coming very, very slowly. That's membrane accommodation caused by slowly rising stimulus intensity. Well, these are the phases of depolarization. We saw clearly that up to threshold, and then there's a massive upstroke. Now let's see the behavior of potassium channels and potassium exit and repolarization. First point of the nerve we simulated, sodium came in, this point has depolarized. Sodium channels have got closed now. Potassium channel behavior is like this. Potassium exit starts, potassium channel starts opening, and potassium exit starts somewhere between point A and point B. That is, when the sodium entry had started, slowly potassium exit also starts. Of course, potassium channels are sometimes called as lazy channels. They are slow to open and slow to close. Now, what happens is, initially the potassium exit is slow because membrane potential is near minus 70 millivolts, which is close to the equilibrium potential for potassium, minus 90 millivolts. We have already discussed this, that if the membrane potential is close to the equilibrium potential of that ion, then the ion will not move much. After all, what is equilibrium potential? That potential on the membrane at which there is no net movement of that ion. So, at minus 70, if you open the sodium channels and potassium channels, and they both start moving, sodium ions will move much more, much faster. You see, the sodium channels in this instance are voltage gated fast sodium channels. Initially, in the first chapter, when we discussed sodium and potassium movements, and we said that potassium moves much more as compared to sodium, we were talking about the diffusion channels, leaky channels of sodium and potassium, and we were comparing the concentration gradients of those ions. So membrane is 50 to 100 times more permeable to potassium, and a resting membrane therefore is much more permeable to potassium, as we have seen already. But when the membrane is stimulated, membrane begins to excite. Now we are talking about the voltage gated fast sodium channels, tetrodotoxin sensitive voltage gated fast sodium channels. They open fast, that's one. And second is sodium entry now predominates over potassium exit. See, sodium entry begins, and almost after that the potassium exit also starts. But sodium entry predominates. So what I am trying to tell you is, because membrane potential is minus 70 and you have opened the sodium channels now, voltage gated sodium channels, sodium will move much more, because equilibrium potential for sodium is plus 60 millivolts in the case of a nerve, and you have opened the channel at minus 70. which is far away from equilibrium potential for sodium. So sodium entry now predominates over potassium exit. So sodium entry predominates over or dominates over potassium exit, which has also started. Potassium has started going out, and therefore we will make a correction now. We said sodium entry results in depolarization. Now let's make a small change in that, and let's say depolarization is because of net influx of positive charges. Sodium is coming in, but potassium is also going out. But sodium entry would be now much larger over potassium exit. That will result in depolarization. And second point that one may note is, all along we said the resting membranes, all membranes in the body are much more permeable to potassium. Most diffusible ion is potassium, whether it is an excitable cell or non-excitable cell. But now most diffusible ion for an excited membrane, when the membrane excites, is sodium. Sodium diffusion will be much faster. Now sodium wins the race over potassium movement. That results in depolarization. Let us talk about the potassium movement now. It started somewhere between point A and point B. Even as the sodium was entering, potassium has started leaving, but it's happening slowly. Then what happens at plus 35? See, sodium, a surge has happened, membrane has moved to plus 35 millivolts membrane potential, and now the sodium channels have closed. So next point is what happens at plus 35. Potassium exit gathers momentum. Potassium exit will gather momentum, because now membrane has moved to plus 35 millivolts, membrane potential has moved there, and plus 35 is far away from minus 90 millivolts, which is the equilibrium potential for potassium. We have already seen this, that when the membrane potential has moved far away from the equilibrium potential for an ion, then that ion will move much larger amount. So potassium exit will gather momentum at plus 35 millivolt, and now the repolarization will take place. Initially the repolarization will be rapid, and then this part, this is called as slowdown of repolarization, and it's called as after depolarization, which is a misnomer. We will see why. You see, initially the potassium is going out rapidly because, let's say, the concentration gradient for potassium was good, it was large. Let's take some arbitrary values, 145 to 4. Potassium had a large concentration gradient initially, and therefore potassium goes out rapidly. So repolarization would be rapid. But then as potassium goes out, two things will happen. One is the concentration gradient for potassium will narrow, because now the potassium is going out, and it will carry the positive charges to the outside, which will get accumulated. So an electrical potential will, or electrical gradient will get created in the opposite direction, from outside to inside. More positive charges will line up on the outside of the membrane because potassium is going out. So electrical gradient will be created in the opposite direction, from outside to inside, and therefore some potassium might leak back in. But the point is, net potassium exit will slow down. Net potassium exit will slow down, and therefore repolarization will slow there. It will slow down. That's called as after depolarization. Why was it termed after depolarization when actually it is repolarization only? It's because initially when they recorded these changes, the electrode was placed on the surface of the nerve. You see, all the potentials, they have to be recorded from inside of the nerve, inside of the membrane. This potential, they recorded from the surface of the nerve. And what they found was positive charges have accumulated just outside the membrane, and some potassium is going back in due to electrical gradient in the opposite direction. So they termed it wrongly, or rather as a misnomer, after depolarization. Positive charges going in, and electrode was placed on the surface of the membrane where they got positive charges. They called it after depolarization. That's a misnomer. In the heart also, such potentials occur after depolarizations. They are responsible for arrhythmias, extrasystole types of arrhythmias. We will see that later. But that's after depolarization. And then finally, hyperpolarization. The point is hyperpolarized. Inside becomes more negative, say minus 90 millivolts. That's because of delayed closure of potassium channels. Potassium channels are lazy channels. They are slow to open. They are slow to close as well. So they remain open, and therefore excess potassium leaves. Excess potassium leaks out, and the membrane potential goes, because then excess negative charges are left behind. Membrane potential goes to minus 90 millivolts again, or rather it's hyperpolarized. Now it can be seen like this, that since the potassium channels were open for a long time, therefore potassium is going out, and as it is going out, it carries the membrane potential towards its own equilibrium potential, and therefore membrane potential would be taken to almost minus 90 millivolts. Potassium is taking the membrane potential towards its own equilibrium potential. Right, that's hyperpolarization. How do you look at hyperpolarization? There are 2-3 issues that need to be understood here. One is, hyperpolarized cell means an inhibited cell. When a cell is hyperpolarized, it will be difficult to excite that cell. That membrane will be difficult to excite. The sodium channels will be in an inactive state, and opening of sodium channels and causing the membrane to reach threshold is difficult from hyperpolarization. You see, moving the membrane potential from minus 70 to threshold and cause the spike, and taking it from minus 90 to threshold, that latter part would be difficult, and therefore membrane will be difficult to excite. That's hyperpolarized membrane. It's a temporarily inhibited membrane, difficult to excite. That's one. Second is, we have said that any excitable tissue, when impulse passes through that tissue, after every impulse there is a process of recharging. So now that the action potential has happened at one point, and it's going to happen at every point, there will be recharging, and recharging is the job of sodium potassium pump. So sodium potassium pump will now cause the sodium to be pumped out. Sodium has come in and caused depolarization, so it will be sent out now, and the potassium which has gone out and caused repolarization, it will be brought back in to the cell. That's recharging done by the sodium potassium pump. But remember, then if recharging occurs at the end of action potential, here the action potential has developed, it has been completed. If recharging occurs at this point, then what is going to happen is membrane will become even more negative. Remember, sodium potassium pump is electrogenic. It creates slightly more negativity on the inside, slightly more negative potential on the inside of the membrane. So if sodium potassium pump were to be active at this point, then inside of the membrane will become even more negative. How is it that then that the membrane will again go back to its original potential of minus 70 millivolt? It has to go back to its original resting potential two processes happen at the same time? The answer is two processes will happen simultaneously when membrane has been hyperpolarized. The leaky sodium channels, they are always there. They are there in every tissue, and sodium leaking in is a continuous process everywhere happening in the body. So leaky sodium channels will allow the leakage of sodium to happen. So positive charges are leaking in, and sodium potassium pump is also doing the process of recharging. These two processes will happen simultaneously at the end of action potential. So positive charges are also leaking in now again by the leaky sodium channels. Therefore, the membrane potential will come back to its original resting potential of minus 70 millivolts. And then it will be resting at minus 70. You know, at minus 70, the activity of sodium potassium pump and the leakage of sodium ions in, they both will balance out each other, and the membrane will rest at minus 70. Whereas at minus 90, leakage of sodium charges or positive charges would be much more positive charges will leak in. Therefore, membrane comes back at minus 70 again. Okay, that's these are the phases of action potential at one point of the nerve, the ionic basis of action potential at one point of the nerve. We have some more dimensions to be discussed. For example, the gating behavior of the sodium and potassium channels. You know, let's try to understand the gating behavior of the sodium and potassium channels. Sodium channels, they have two gates and three possible states. And based on this, I'm going to explain two things: the basis for refractory period and mechanism of action of local anesthetics. These two things can be explained on the basis of this gating behavior of sodium channels. Let's try to understand what this gating behavior is. Sodium channels have two gates. Here is a sodium channel, the voltage gated fast sodium channel. The two gates are M gate, which is the activation gate, and H gate, which is the inactivation gate. You see, when the activation gates are opened, sodium channel is said to be activated and sodium influx will happen. And when the inactivation gates are closed, the channel will be closed, inactivated, sodium entry cannot happen. Potassium channels, they have only one gate, which is the N gate. When the gate opens, channel is opened and potassium exit will happen, and when the gate closes, the channel will be closed. That's for the potassium channel. N gate, just one gate, which is on the inner aspect of the membrane. Yeah, watch this part, that the activation gates are on the external part of the membrane, nerve membrane. This is the nerve membrane, and this is the axoplasm of the nerve. And inactivation gate is on the inner aspect of the nerve membrane. Logically, it is understandable. You apply the stimulus from outside the nerve membrane, and that stimulus will open the activation gate and sodium entry will happen. And voltage gated the sodium channels. they are going to sense the voltage on the inner aspect of the nerve membrane, and accordingly they are going to close, and therefore the closing gates, inactivation gates, are on the inner aspect of the channel or inner aspect of the membrane. These are the gates. Let us see the gating behavior of the sodium channels during action potential. There are three possible states of the sodium channels. First, at RMP, when the nerve membrane is resting, the sodium channels are in the first state, which is called as resting state of the sodium channels. And how do you describe the resting state? The M gates are closed. They are in a closed state. That's the resting state. Now, H gates are open though, but M gates are in a closed state. You apply stimulus to the nerve membrane and the sodium channels begin to open. So that's the second state, activation state. Activation state is open state, so M gates are opened. H gates were already open, M gates are also open now that the channel is open, activated, and therefore sodium influx will happen. Then the third state, inactivation state, just above threshold. At threshold, a massive influx of sodium has happened, and even as the sodium is coming in, the channels go into the third state, which is the inactivated state or inactivation state. How is this state described? H gates are closed. Just above threshold, even as the that massive influx has happened, the channels go into the third state, the inactivation state. H gates are closed. Now let's try to understand, first point, mechanism of action of local anesthetics. Local anesthetics are used at many places in the medicine. If you see dentists, they use local anesthetics during root canals or such procedures. They first stimulate the area and then they inject the local anesthetic into the cheek. Why? Why do they have to stimulate the area first? Stimulate the nerve membrane or stimulate that area is because the local anesthetics, lignocaine, which is used commonly, they have a low affinity for the resting state but high affinity for the inactivated state. Local anesthetics, they bind vividly to the inactivated state of the sodium channels, which comes after the activated state. So, if the nerve is resting and you inject the local anesthetic, it is not going to have much effect because local anesthetics will not bind to the resting state. They have low affinity for the resting state. But after the nerve is activated, then the channels go into inactivated state, and that is when they can bind more vividly. Therefore, you have to first stimulate the nerve before you apply or inject local anesthetic. So local anesthetics, they bind vividly to the inactivated state, and their mechanism of action is that local anesthetic, they bind to and prolong the inactivated state. Of the sodium channels. So, sodium channels will remain in the inactivated state, and since sodium channels are not available, impulse conduction will not happen, depolarization cannot happen. That's mechanism of action of local anesthetics. The second point is the basis for refractory period. What is the basis for refractory period? Or let's try to first understand what is refractory period. Refractoriness means unresponsiveness. the tissue does not respond once again. So refractory period is that time period after every stimulus during which another stimulus cannot excite the tissue for one more time. That time period is called as refractory period. So it's a time period. What is the basis for this? You see, you have applied the first stimulus and depolarization started, but the sodium channels are into that cycle of activated state and then inactivated state. You know, these channels, after inactivation state, they will slowly return to their original resting state, the sodium channels. How or when they will return to their original resting state? When membrane recovery occurs by about 40 millivolts of repolarization. Recovery or repolarization up to 40 millivolts, minus 40 millivolts. By that time, majority of the sodium channels will have recovered and gone back to their original resting state. And only after that, if you apply another stimulus, you can generate one more action potential. You can excite the membrane for one more time. Let us see this in the graph of action potential to understand the time course. We have applied the first stimulus at this point of time. Sodium channels have gone into that cycle of opening and then inactivation. And as we saw, recovery by up to minus 40 millivolts. Up to this point of time and up to that voltage, sodium channels, majority of them will have recovered and they will be available for one more time for the membrane excitation. But up to this point of time, the period would be called as absolute refractory period. Absolute refractory period means no amount of stimulus, whatever strong, can generate one more action potential in that nerve. Why absolute? Because the sodium channels were not even available for one more excitation. They were in that cycle. And only when the membrane has recovered to minus 40 millivolts, majority of the sodium channels have now recovered. Therefore, another stimulus may excite the nerve for one more time. But the latter part, after the absolute refractory period is over, there is some duration which is called as relative refractory period. What is the meaning of relative refractory period? A normal stimulus cannot excite the tissue once again, but a stronger than normal stimulus can excite the tissue for one more time. One more action potential can be generated by a stronger than normal stimulus. Why? Because at this point of time, when the membrane has recovered to up to minus 40 millivolts repolarization, majority of the channels have recovered, not all have recovered. Therefore, if you apply a normal stimulus, one more sodium channel cycle may not cause to reach the threshold and cause the spike. But a stronger than normal stimulus with a stronger intensity, rapidly rising intensity, may cause a quick opening of sodium channels and the tissue can excite again. So that's called as relative refractory period. You need a stronger stimulus to cause one more excitation. That is the refractory period and its basis and its types. So basically, after every stimulus, there is a time period during which the tissue cannot excite for one more time. Another stimulus will not excite the tissue for once again. That's called as refractory period. What is the significance of refractory period? Significance of refractory period is that refractory period determines the frequency of stimulation of that tissue. How much can be the highest frequency of stimulation of a tissue is determined by the refractory period. let's take an example. This is just an example to understand this phenomenon. Let's say refractory period of a tissue is 1 second. What is the meaning of this? This is just an example. Actually, it would be in milliseconds. Let's try to understand by taking these examples. Let's say 1 second is the refractory period. Means after every stimulus, you have to wait for 1 second. Only then your next stimulus can excite the tissue for one more time. After this 1 second is over, you can apply the stimulus at any point. It's okay. The tissue will be excitable once again. But not before this. Not before this 1 second is over. Tissue is refractory in that 1 second. So, imagine that you apply the stimulus immediately at the end of 1 second. It means what? Again, you have to wait for 1 second to apply the third stimulus. Because refractory period 1 second, it should be over again. Only then the next stimulus will be useful or productive, or it will excite the nerve once again. And then at the end of this 1 second, you can excite the tissue after that time, anytime after that refractory period is over. So again, if you decide to stimulate the tissue for one more time, third stimulus, again you have to wait for 1 second. So the point that I'm making is, this tissue can be stimulated maximally at highest frequency would be about highest frequency would be 60 times in a minute, because after its refractory period is 1 second. At the end of 1 second, you can stimulate that tissue once again, and so on and so forth. So highest frequency can be 60 times in a minute, not more than that. Now imagine some tissue with a refractory period of 5 seconds, longer refractory period. That means after every stimulus, you have to wait for 5 seconds. Only then the tissue will be excitable once again. That means you can excite this tissue maximally at the frequency of 12 times in a minute, not more than that. So the point is that longer the refractory period, the tissue frequency of stimulation cannot be higher in that case. Remember, heart has got longer refractory periods, and therefore heart muscle cannot be stimulated at very high frequencies. That's the behavior of sodium and potassium channels during action potential. Finally, let's see the effects of ions on the action potential. Changes in the ECF concentrations of various ions. Let's see what is the effect of changes in the ECF concentration of sodium. Well, first point, we already know now that changes in the ECF sodium will affect the action potential, and changes in the ECF potassium will affect the RMP, resting membrane potential. We've already done with this part resting membrane is much more permeable to potassium, and an excited membrane, sodium takes precedence over potassium. Therefore, changes in the ECF concentrations will more affect the action potential. For example, what will be the effect of hyponatremia? You see, sodium 141 on the outside, 14 on the inside. Instead, if it is 125 in the ECF, that's hyponatremia. It means what? Concentration gradient for sodium has narrowed. Which means what? Which means at threshold, with that massive influx, less sodium will come in. And therefore, the result is amplitude of action potential will decrease. And in severe conditions, in severe hyponatremia, conduction may stop completely. Action potential propagation may stop completely. That's now logical to understand. You see, sodium coming in from one point, it carries the positive charges to the next point. So next point automatically reaches threshold and sodium channels open at that point and the positive charges come in and they go to the next point. Imagine severe hyponatremia. Less and less sodium is going to come in because concentration gradient for sodium has narrowed now. And a point will come where sodium coming in from one point, it's not good enough to take the next point to threshold. Threshold will not be reached at the next point and action potential will fail to develop and then fail to propagate beyond that point. So that's possible in the conditions of severe hyponatremia. Conduction blocks will happen. Hypernatremia will have opposite effect. More sodium will come in at the threshold. So amplitude of action potential will increase. Second, changes in the ECF concentrations of potassium. As we already said, a resting membrane is much more permeable to potassium. Therefore, changes in the ECF potassium concentrations will affect the RMP. What will be the, for example, what's the result of hypokalemia? Hypokalemia, for instance, 145 on the inside and 4 on the outside. These are the potassium concentrations. Instead of 4, if it has become 2.5. That means concentration gradient for potassium has widened, and that means excess potassium will leave. And if excess potassium leaves, excess positive charges leave, the membrane will be hyperpolarized. So there would be hyperpolarization of the membrane. Membrane will be difficult to excite. What will be the result of hyperkalemia? The result of hyperkalemia, let's say potassium instead of 4, it has become 6 or 8. It means two things. The concentration gradient for potassium will narrow. That means less potassium can leak out. Second point is, because of the hyperkalemia, more potassium, that means more positive charges on the outside of the membrane. And therefore, what will happen is membrane will depolarize instead of hyperpolarization. Since positive charges have lined up on the outside of the membrane, potassium will find it difficult to leave. There is an electrical gradient in the opposite direction that is being created. So potassium might just come near the membrane instead of going out from inside to outside. It comes just near the membrane and membrane may depolarize. So the effect is that membrane might slightly depolarize, but let's say hyperkalemia, membrane depolarizes and let's say it comes here. Would it be more excitable membrane? It would appear to be so, because the membrane has moved closer to the threshold, and if it is closer to the threshold, it may be more excitable. I mean, it appears like that. No, the answer is again the membrane will be less excitable, because even if it has moved closer to the threshold, would it be easier to reach the threshold and therefore excite? No. Whether a membrane will excite or not depends on which ionic current is responsible, which ionic current is available at that point, at that voltage of the membrane. If the membrane is partly depolarized, but because of that part depolarization, if the sodium channels have gone into inactivation state after a first few action potentials, I am saying first few action potentials have completed and sodium channels have gone into inactivation state, And since membrane is less negative, they will remain in the inactivation state. They are voltage gated, of course. That means sodium channels are not available to cause excitation. So even if membrane has moved slightly closer to the threshold in hyperkalemia, the membrane has slightly depolarized, it will not be more excitable. The point that I'm making is whether it is hyperpolarization, whether it is hypokalemia or whether it is hyperkalemia, in both instances membrane is less excitable. It will be less excitable. The logic that applies for hyperpolarization, that the membrane is more negative and therefore it will be difficult to reach threshold from that potential. That same logic in the reverse will not apply for partly depolarized membrane, that it has moved closer to the threshold, so more excitable. No. Whether the membrane excites or not depends on the ionic currents available to cause depolarization. Third ion is calcium. What is the effect of changes in the ECF concentrations of calcium? Well, first thing, ECF calcium is necessary for, ECF calcium up to a certain level is necessary for stability of the sodium channel gating. The sodium channel and its gating behavior, it depends on the ECF calcium. So, in the condition of, let's say, hypocalcemia, hypocalcemia, when serum calcium decreases, is a condition that happens in hypoparathyroidism. Parathyroid hormone is going to maintain the serum calcium levels. The condition is called as tetany. So in tetany, in hypocalcemia, sodium channel gating will become unstable as the calcium level has fallen in the ECF and in the serum. And therefore, what happens now is, with a faint stimulus, sodium channels will open and they will remain activated. Sodium channels will open and remain activated. They cannot be inactivated now because their gating mechanism is failing. They remain activated and therefore a volley of impulses will be sent through the nerve. This volley of impulses sent through the nerve to the muscle will cause a sustained contraction of the muscle. That's called as tetany. You see, there are signs of tetany such as Trozou's sign and Schwostek's sign. Trozou's sign is carpopedal spasm, or Schwostek's sign, facial muscle spasm. How do you elicit those signs? For Trozou's sign, you apply BP cuff to the arm, increase the pressure, and it shows, and then it goes into carpopedal spasm. Or for Schwostek's sign, tap over the angle of the mandible, and then you see the facial muscles have gone into spasm. So why do you have to elicit these signs in this manner? Because you are applying a faint stimulus. When you apply this faint stimulus, then sodium channels open and they remain activated. That's the explanation for tetany, that the muscles go into sustained contraction. What I want to tell you here is tetany and tetanus, similar sounding names. In both the cases, tetany means I stretch. It would be a sustained contraction of the muscle, whether tetany or tetanus. But in tetany, the sustained contraction is coming from, or rather is caused by altered gating of sodium channels in the nerve. It's acting via nerve. The hypocalcemia is acting via nerve. On the other hand, tetanus is the sustained contraction of the muscle resulting from increased intracellular calcium or increased sarcoplasmic calcium. See, here it is decreased ECF calcium acting via nerve and its sodium channels, and tetanus is increased sarcoplasmic calcium in the muscle causing sustained contraction of the muscle. We will talk about the tetanus when we discuss the muscle physiology.